Jen, that was great. And again, definitely some recurring themes here, but I love that we're coming at it from different aspects. So we're all sort of focused on what is the messaging, how do we generate the focus on the intersection of climate and health, which is a nascent intersection, an area of focus. How do we do that in a cohesive and impactful way? But how do we do that through data and AI systems, and how do we do that through very specific messaging? And I loved that in Jen's report out, there were some very specific moments and messages and partners to help championing those, and getting as specific as things like the language of the cover text and what we can aspire to there. So I think that's the perfect kind of thing for us to be thinking about. And probably continuing along those lines in terms of mobilizing resources, focus, financial resources, innovation. We'll turn to our next roundtable readout. This one was the one that we had titled Private Sector Catalysts, and we had invited Community Jameel, GSK, and Forum for the Future to host that discussion to really talk about the unique role of the private sector in catalyzing innovation and mobilizing resources, but really through that catalytic funds and innovation to get things started. And so I think for the private sector session, we'll have Sally Uren. She's the CEO of Forum for the Future. So help welcome Sally, because I don't believe that she's been on the agenda to date. So introducing Sally Uren.
Thanks very much, Kelly. I don't have any slides. I've got this. I'm going to bring it to life for you. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be part of the conversation this morning. So I'm Sally, I'm CEO of Forum for the Future. We're a sustainability non-profit. We operate in the UK, US, India, and Singapore. Our mission is to accelerate progress towards a sustainable future. And we run lots of pre-competitive multi-stakeholder collaborations. And one of those is the Climate and Health Coalition, which is why I'm here today. We've been working with private sector actors for the last 3 to 4 years, understanding what do we need to do to really unlock the role of the private sector to drive co-benefits for climate and health, taking very much a systems approach, recognizing our climate emergency, our health emergency, they're both systemic challenges, and we need to bring that systemic thinking to bear. So our role in the session earlier was to really answer the question, how do we unlock the ability of the private sector to drive progress at this intersection of climate and health? And we had a great discussion. It was brilliant that we actually did have the system in the room. So we had private sector actors, we had philanthropy, academics, civil society. So we had a representation of the whole system that needs to be engaged to drive this kind of systemic change. And what we concluded is that the first thing that really needs to happen is a greater shared understanding of the role of the private sector in driving co-benefits for climate and for health. Yes, it's access to finance, and within that there is access to finance for seed funding, access to finance for scaling, but it's more than that. The private sector, through its supply chains, through its brands, has enormous reach, can reach citizens around the world, can therefore play a role in education perhaps. The private sector is also a source of huge innovation, has many partnerships across academia, across other parts of the system. And of course, what the private sector has at the moment around this emerging space is data. So how might that data become shared, utilized to create change? And what we concluded in the conversation is that there isn't yet a shared understanding of the role of the private sector. So it's more than just finance. There's lots of other aspects of the private sector that could drive activity in this space. And there are kind of 3 lenses to that as well. There's both the direct role that the private sector can play. The private sector needs to urgently decarbonize. That will reduce carbon emissions as well as play a role in adaptation. We also, and that speaks to the sort of indirect role. And then there's also the fact that we can see a different role for the private sector in different parts of the world. So in the discussion we heard that actually in Africa, parts of Africa, for example, the private sector, through its role of innovation, can show the way for governments to then follow. So being really clear about how that role of the private sector can be context specific. So that would be our first ask of COP28 is, let's create this shared understanding, because with that shared understanding, then we can unlock the different ways in which the private sector can drive change. We then got onto the second part of our discussion, and these could be focal areas for conversation at COP28, recognizing that COP28 is, a moment in time. But the question then becomes, if we have a shared understanding of the role of the private sector through its direct impacts, its indirect impacts through working alone, working in collaboration, how do we really begin to unlock this? And just to echo the two previous readouts, we really felt that there is a role for education. And so, how can we create a strong narrative around COP28 that helps not just the healthcare industry, so within the private sector, the healthcare players have got a reasonable understanding of the intersectionality of climate and health. But I know this through our work, if you go into food, into tech, into the built environment, that understanding isn't there. So what's the role of education and really shining a light on the links? And this is where I would really echo the remarks earlier this morning. Health brings a human face to climate. It makes it very relatable, very real. So how do we use COP28 as an education moment? Within that, how can we get greater consistency amongst terminology and language? Even the words decarbonisation don't mean the same thing across different geographies, different sectors. Then very specific things that we felt could form part of the conversation at COP28 is, might we use COP28 to showcase cost-efficient solutions for the private sector to drive to net zero, but in ways that drive health benefits? And that's very much been the focus of the Climate and Health Coalition. We've produced guidance for the private sector. We launched an updated guidance document in Sharm el-Sheikh, practical guidance to help every private sector actor in pulling together a net zero strategy go that tiny bit further and talk about what are the health benefits for their employees, their supply chains, communities, wider public health. So how might we make those cost-effective solutions visible and available as part of the conversation? The second thing we thought around is guidelines. So at the moment, there is this massive energy around E, S, and G, environmental, social governance. The H isn't there. So how might we produce guidelines for the integration of the H into ESG? Equally, there are indexes. There's a health inclusivity index. How might we build climate into that? So where are there existing standards, ratings that would benefit from that integration of climate and health? Critically, again, we just need to keep emphasizing that the interpretation of such guidance it needs to be geographically specific. So what works in the US, what might work in Europe, might not work in Latin America. So how do we get that specificity of context? And then we also recognize that there is a need to share learning. So we've created, with the Climate and Health Coalition, guidance for the private sector. We've created case studies. We now really want people to test this guidance and to share what works, what doesn't. And sometimes that can be reluctance to be that open and honest, but how do we use neutral platforms such as ours to share that learning? And then critically, what the private sector could really do much better at is create a shared voice into policymakers, a really clear ask of policymakers in terms of what the private sector really needs to galvanize action at scale. The last part of our conversation actually directly contradicts the previous readout, which is we felt it was really important to build on what's already there. And so, rather controversially, we thought a success indicator for COP28 might be no new funds announced, but actually let's leverage the existing funds that we've got and push them further and push them faster. There is a tendency, particularly in the climate space, which is I'm much more familiar with, to create all these new funds, and meanwhile we're losing momentum, we're losing focus on what we're really trying to do, and we're splintering capital. So how do we take what we've already got, both in terms of existing funds, collaborative platforms? The World Business Council for Sustainable Development is doing some work in this space. As the Climate and Health Coalition, we've engaged with over 40 different 40 organizations involved in climate and health. We really need to keep drawing the thread between what's already happening. And so in some, where we feel that there is potential for COP28 is integration of the climate and health agenda from that private sector perspective, with specific examples of what's working already. There are lots of examples, and just getting that clarity of how the private sector can work with civil society, work with philanthropy, work with government to unlock action at the pace and the scale that we know is needed. I think that is it. Happy to take any clarifying questions if there are any. Yeah, so I think we do need more money, but there are already existing funds that can be deployed. I think the point is that there is a temptation to set up a lot of new things in this space. There's already a lot that is happening that with more funding could really bring scaling and bring innovation to really bear and make the difference that we all know is possible. Anything else, Fiona?